to the Friday, May 17th edition of the Clemson Dubcast. As promised, a second Dubcast for this week, making up for the absence of one a couple of weeks ago. And it is a really good one with George Schroeder, the national college football writer. A lot going on in Clemson's football recruiting. Paul Strelo, of course, has lots of really good intel and info at TigerIllustrated.com. Up right now, the latest with five-star defensive end Myles Murphy, who is slated to announce his college destination at halftime of his school's spring game. And more on Kobe Pryor, Cedartown, Georgia running back, who is also going to reveal his decision during a birthday party. I will have something later today on the ACC's continuing sort of 11th hour negotiations with potential cable providers of the ACC network. Interesting situation there as the ACC tries to generate a lot of the profits that the SEC network did 4 years ago, although now it seems to be a much different time with the landscape of how people consume their sports and other stuff. But that'll be up this afternoon at TigerIllustrated.com. Title sponsor of the Clemson Dubcast, Parham Smith Archenhold Law Firm in downtown Greenville. They have been with us from the very beginning, since before the beginning, when this was just an idea. Blake Smith has been a good friend of mine for years, dating back to the days when he taught a law class at Clemson with Terry Don Phillips. Also, Brooke Archenhold, major Clemson fans. The forte of their firm, which is at 15 Washington Park in Greenville, is medical negligence. They represent patients and their families in medical negligence actions. Also handle all sorts of other personal injury litigation. Free consultations at Parham Smith and Archenhold. Give them a call, 864-990-4581, or go to parhamlaw.com. Also sponsoring the Dubcast is Tandem Payment, company headquartered in Greenville, South Carolina, and headed up by a Clemson graduate, 2005. The newest program Tandem offers gives business owners an opportunity to eliminate up to 100% of your annual credit card processing fees. The best part, it encourages more transactions inside your business. Plus, you save the typical processing fees you pay annually. Call Tandem today to learn more about how to eliminate your credit card processing fees. Want to learn more? Visit tandempayment.com today. Okay, before we get started today with George Schroeder, want to let you know about a message from Gary Cohen, the general manager at the Abernathy Boutique Hotel over at Taps Bar and Cafe. They collect the old Taps yearbooks, and they don't have them all. They have quite a bit. They've done a really good job of collecting those, but Gary asked me to let the listeners know if some of y'all have some of those old yearbooks, give them a call at the Abernathy or go by there, and if you do have one that they do not have, they will give you some pretty sweet discounts on beverages and such over at the Taps Bar and Cafe. Phone number is 864-654-5299 or online at theabernathy.com. Okay, let's get to it. Interview with George Schroeder of USA Today. Enjoy. Okay, George Schroeder. Man, I have been really looking forward to this interview, George, mainly because of all the people I encounter in covering the playoff and a bunch of the national guys. Man, you're one of the nicest people, not just sports writers, but people I've ever met.
I don't really know how to respond to that other than thank you. I appreciate you saying that. And sometimes if somebody says that, I think maybe I need to develop more teeth. But no, listen, I appreciate it. I want to be kind to people. And so some days I actually achieve that goal. And listen, I see a lot of people out there, and there's a lot of good people doing great work there, and you're definitely among them. And so it's always fun to get to, when you and I get to visit, all too rarely, when I'm in Clemson or we catch up with each other on the road.
There's this caricature of the old, grizzled, angry sports writer who is always talking about how much better it was in the old days and is perpetually stressed out. And you are a convincing argument for the opposite of that, hey, this is not this is not that big of a deal. We're getting to write about college sports, which is a pretty good life, huh?
Well, we are, and I like the way you say that. I mean, we are getting to write about college sports, and it's really important to a lot of people, and rightly so. And obviously, it's clearly big business. Dabo's new contract would indicate that, right? But it's in the end, it's sports, and it's not life or death. And I think that's a good perspective to have. I mean, listen, I'm very appreciative of the fact that I get to do it, and that it's important enough that people want to pay me to do it, and people want to pay you to do it. But I can think of other professions where you might feel like you were, it was a little more important.
All right. I don't want to trivialize your personal story by talking about X's and O's and things like that. I just want to dive right into just an amazing, emotional story about your son, Christopher, who was born with a defective heart. Am I getting that right? Or y'all discovered that when he was in the womb?
Yeah, that's right. He was. We did discover that through an ultrasound before he was born, that he had multiple heart defects, and so there was a real question as to whether he would make it to birth. And then when he did, they expected him to get sort of a series of 3 surgeries: one at about a week old, one at several months old, and then another when he was a year or 2 old. And instead, about 6 or 7 days after he was born, he crashed, and they determined that plan had to go out the window. And Christopher, we're very thankful, ended up with a heart transplant when he was 7 weeks old. And there's a little more to that story, obviously. And then when he was 22 months old, he needed a kidney transplant. And since he got that, he's really flourished. But those first 2 years, he spent probably more than half of his first 2 years in the hospital, various children's hospitals.
And you gave him one of your kidneys?
Yeah, well, I had 2, Larry, so I figured, might as well give one up. No, listen, I'm sorry to be joking about that, but that's what dads do. That's what moms do. That's what brothers and sisters do. And I think it's wired into the hearts of fathers by God that you give good gifts to your children. So when I found out I was a match, first of all, I was very hopeful I was a match. And when I found out I was a match, there was no question that if everything worked out and all the testing went well, that I would do that. And the reason that it took him so long to get a kidney to 22 months was they want to put adult kidneys in these little bitty guys, and he needed to grow, quite frankly, in order to, an adult kidney is the size of kind of an adult fist, a man's fist. And so you can imagine to put that in a toddler's abdomen, especially a guy who's a little guy, small, our little guy, Christopher, we're happy when he's actually on the growth chart, like at 2%, that's the way it's been from birth. So you can imagine how long it took and in order for him to be big enough for an adult kidney. So yeah, I was glad to give it. And, if I had another one, he could have another one. Hopefully he's not going to need one for a long, long time. But if he does, my wife is also a match, so we're thankful. And then his brother and his sister are also a match.
When your child needs and gets a heart transplant, it means that someone else lost a child. How difficult was that? Or I don't want to say conflicting, but maybe it was. What was that like for you and your wife?
Well, it was conflicting, and because you do know where, it's one thing to speak lightly, as I was sort of half joking about giving a kidney, but you can give a kidney and you have 2 of them, and life goes on for me exactly the same as it did. I have no, there's no change at all in my habits or anything else, and there doesn't need to be, and that's great. It's really cool. It's neat the way that works out. Obviously, that's not the case with a heart, and regardless of the age, I think this would be very similar. But when you realize that our 7-week-old received a heart, and just sort of by definition, given the size, it was some infant's heart, you realize that even as our infant is being given the gift of life, some other family is going through this terrible heartbreak that you can only imagine. And that was a really, it was a hard time. We were so thankful, and yet at the same time, you realize somebody else somewhere. And we didn't know the family, and we don't know the family, although we have reached out through the avenues you're able to reach out through, and just said, hey, we're so thankful, and if you'd ever like to meet Christopher and us, we would love to, and we understand if you don't want to. And we have not heard back. And so I'm hopeful that one day we'll be able to thank the parents. I don't know if that will happen, but it was a really, really, really difficult thing to know where a heart comes from and how your son received a gift of life.
Christopher was born 7 years ago. Is that correct?
He's actually 9.
Oh, okay.
And so the heart is 9 years old as well. And, he got the kidney, 7.5 years ago. So he's really flourished. He's a third grader. He's a little behind his peers. And we don't know that there's any kind of a ceiling for him, and we haven't been told there is one. We just know that, his first 2 years were such that he's been playing catch up ever since. And we're very hopeful that he's going to catch up.
And he does. He's fond of play-by-play. Did I read that correctly?
He absolutely is, Larry. He will watch. So sometimes you get up in the morning, he's already up, and he has turned on ESPN Classic or one of the conference networks or whatever he can find that there's a game on, and he is watching the game. And then the next thing you know, he's shooting baskets later in the day, and he's doing sort of his own play-by-play. He doesn't do just the one guy. He does both of them. He does the play-by-play guy and the color analyst. It's usually Bob and Steve, whoever they are. But yeah, absolutely. It wouldn't stun me if one day he ended up doing play-by-play or something like that. He may do a lot of different things, but he loves sports, loves football, loves basketball, especially those two sports, loves to watch them, and then loves to talk about them.
You have other children, George?
Yeah, I have a daughter who is a freshman in college. She's at the University of Oklahoma, and then a son who is a rising senior. He's just finishing his junior year in high school, and we don't know where he's going to go. Just sort of going through that process of trying to figure it out.
Can you describe the personal, professional, spiritual impact of this with Christopher? What it has meant? Yeah.
Well, I can try. Let me just say this. First of all, I'm a follower of Christ, and I am hopeful that he is my be-all, end-all, and that everything flows from my faith. I will say this, you learn about your faith when you go through something like this. And so we went into this from the time we knew, from the day we got this awful ultrasound news that there's a heart issue with this new little guy. We found out that he was a boy, and then we got called back up to find out that he had these heart issues, and they weren't even sure if he'd make it to birth. From that day, we basically said, okay, God, I know you're good, and whatever you bring, you're good. And so that was it. God is good, whatever he brings. That was our kind of our approach. And when I say our, I don't mean just, it's not an editorial we. I'm talking about my wife. She's also a Christ follower. And so we prayed hard for the outcome that we've ended up getting, but which is, at this point, a healthy, happy little guy who's growing. But we knew that might not be the case, and we knew God would be good anyway. So, Larry, I have to tell you, it was both faith stretching and faith affirming, just in seeing how God worked throughout that process. But yeah, it was a terribly tough time, and I think more than suddenly having faith in Jesus, I think at that point I realized, wow, you've given me this faith, and you're allowing me, you're sort of strengthening me to be able to go through this. Because people always want to say, oh, you guys are so strong. I don't know that we're strong at all. But you just sort of felt like you were sustained from day to day and from moment to moment. during that time period when he was in the hospital in Little Rock, Arkansas for the first. After he was born, he was flown from Portland to Little Rock. Long story, and he was in that hospital for 6 weeks before he gets a heart, and then the kidneys fail. He's in that hospital for 9 more months, and they transfer him back to Portland, Oregon. He's in that hospital for another 3 months, basically, and then he's in and out of the hospital for a lot of the time before he finally gets the kidney. And in those days and in those moments, all you have to go on is just, okay, God, I know you're good, and thank you for that, and we're going to follow you.
And you lived in Oklahoma City at the time?
No, actually, I was a columnist in Eugene, Oregon, and working for the Register Guard of Eugene. And so he was actually born in Portland at the Children's Hospital and the med school combination there, Oregon Health and Sciences University. And then to make a short story really long, he ended up in my hometown of Little Rock at Arkansas Children's Hospital because we had gotten a second opinion before he was born about that initial diagnosis. We had gone back to Shannon and my wife had gone back to our hometown and had consulted with the OBGYNs and the various heart cardiologists and even the cardiac surgeon there at the time, and they had said that's the correct diagnosis going back to Oregon, and we agree. And so when that diagnosis, which was the right diagnosis, when his little body wasn't going to handle those 3 surgeries that I talked to you about, we looked around because they said the only thing that can be done is a heart transplant, which is terrible news, obviously. But the next thing you think about is, okay, what do we do? And they said, we don't do pediatric heart transplants in Portland. The way this is set up, they're all regionally based. And so they offered us Seattle or Stanford in the Bay Area or down in Southern California. And we didn't know anybody in any of those places. And so we said, what about Little Rock? And they kind of thought to themselves, and the first problem was it was not in network, as everybody who has health insurance understands. It's all sort of locally state-based these days. And so we ended up in Little Rock because it worked out. And you know why it worked out? I will tell you, it's because I said, Lord, help. And Larry, an hour later, it was in network. They just decided to call it in network. And then the next thing is, okay, Arkansas Children's Hospital will be fine. We'll make that in network, but you're going to need a medical transport, which means a private flight with a doctor, a nurse, some other kind of medical technician, and obviously a pilot, and a little baby in an incubator. And that's going to be $48,000, and the insurance isn't going to cover it. Oh, man. And so I said, Lord, help. I just didn't know what to do, but obviously we're going to figure it out. I mean, journalists don't have $48,000 lying around most of the time, right? So, and a couple hours later, it was taken care of. And it's my understanding that the 2 hospitals and the insurance company all basically got together and said, we'll figure out a way to cover this.
Oh, wow.
And they did. And so he ended up in Little Rock. That's how he got to Little Rock. So we were living, you had a very short question. I had a very long answer, but we were living in Eugene, Oregon at the time. His medical care was in Portland, which is 110 miles from Eugene. And then we ended up 2,000 miles away in Little Rock, which is where my wife and Christopher and his older 2 siblings basically spent most of the next 9 months. So, but that's when I told you that we saw God working through those things, not even necessarily in getting an outcome we desired, but just sort of showing us he was there. Those are the kinds of things that happened even on the toughest day, which was, in my mind, the day that we learned that our little guy needed a heart transplant. You saw those kinds of things working.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I'm going to give you one. I'm going to tell you one more thing. So remember I told you that Shannon, my wife, had gone a couple of months before he was born to Little Rock to get a second opinion at Arkansas Children's Hospital. She met with all those doctors, including the cardiac surgeon. So Now, on the day after, 2 days after he had crashed at birth, a week after birth, the team that was sort of the cardiology team in Portland met to say, all right, what's the new diagnosis need to be? What kind of a new plan can we have for this little infant? Because the series of 3 surgeries is out the window. Well, just so happened that day, shadowing the cardiology team and consulting with them in Portland was this doctor from Little Rock. Just happened to be there that day. So he sat in on this meeting and already had sort of a passing familiarity with the case, because he was the cardiac surgeon from Little Rock who had given a second opinion to my wife when Christopher was, not born yet. And so when we got that diagnosis later that day from one of the doctors, heart transplant, it was a terrible thing. I hated to hear that. I also knew that doctor was in the room, and I thought, wow, this is interesting. There's no reason for him to be in that room in Portland on this day, in this meeting, other than the fact that, somebody put him there. There's a lot of reasons he was there, right? But if I was a fiction writer, as some coaches like to accuse us of being, Larry, if I was a fiction writer and I tried to drop that doctor into Portland on that day, they probably wouldn't. Somebody would come back, some editor, and say, you got to come up with a better reason for him to be there, other than this just happens to be the time he's consulting with this cardiology team. But that's what it was. And 6 weeks later, that cardiac surgeon transplanted the heart into my son.
Amazing.
And not because he transplanted the heart into Christopher, not because Christopher is 9 years old and doing well, but just in that moment, it was almost like God was saying, hey, I can do anything I want. Trust me. And not even trust me for the outcome. Trust me that I'm good.
And so Christopher is still immune suppressed. He has to take anti-rejection drugs. Is that?
Yeah, that's right. For both organs. And that's true of all organ transplant recipients. So for both the heart and the kidney. So he takes immune suppression drugs, anti-rejection drugs in the morning and then at night. And it's pretty minimally invasive, but it is something you have to do and you can't forget to do. And unless there are further advances in medicine, which obviously could happen, that's currently would be the plan for the rest of his life.
So when y'all moved to Little Rock, who were you working for then?
Well, so we didn't move. The family just sort of picked up and moved there. And my family's back there. So there was a support group there. And that's where we had lived. Shannon and I had lived when we got married. So I stayed in Eugene, is the other piece of this, and continued working for the Register Guard. And that company was terrific in allowing me every 2 or 3 weeks to travel to Little Rock for a week or two, and even to work, even to be on the clock, so to speak, from Little Rock, and sort of maintain my schedule of writing columns. And so we never actually moved. And so, 10 months later, when they transferred Christopher back to the hospital in Portland, the family moved. The rest of the family sort of just came back to Eugene, and it was just it was a really, like I said, it was a really difficult time. But looking back, it's an amazing time too.
Did you go from the Oklahoman newspaper to Eugene?
I did.
Okay.
I did. So I worked for the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette in Little Rock right out of school. And then, which is my hometown newspaper. And I always tell people I got that gig because I started as an intern in the summer, and I got that gig because of all the great work I'd done for my college paper, or maybe it was because the sports editor lived behind my house. We're backdoor neighbors. So I assume, it was location and familiarity. But so I worked for the Democrat Gazette in Little Rock, and then went to the Oklahoma to cover OU football. And then went from there to Eugene to be the columnist at the Register Guard. And when I took the USA Today job, we knew we wanted to move back to the center of the country, and thought about a lot of places, and really had developed an affinity for living in the Oklahoma City area, and specifically Norman, don't have any ties to the area other than we really liked it, and it's the center of the country, and I like living in a college town, and here we are.
And when did you move to USA Today?
In August of 2012, so we're coming up on 7 years here.
Want to introduce our newest sponsor to the Dubcast. Welcome to Uptown Realty, LLC, locally owned and operated out of Sumter, but also they serve the Eastern Midlands and PD area with the buying and selling of homes, commercial properties, and land. Patrick Enzer, a friend of mine who used to cover Clemson football and work in the sports writing industry. He grew up in Anderson, going to Clemson games, been in Sumter for 15 years. Also a loyal listener to the Dubcast. Uptown Realty offers affordable new housing in the mid-130,000s from a local custom builder. Patrick is the sole owner and broker in charge. Give him a call at 803-983-5660. His website is uptownrealtysc.com. Another reason that I've been so eager to chat with you is sort of a common thread, Brent Venables.
Yeah.
You covered him, and you got to know him obviously well enough to, and I admit I was professionally a little jealous of this back in 2015 before the Orange Bowl, when I see you have a column that was written from a morning jog that you had with Brent Venables. What was it like covering him, developing a relationship with him, and even a relationship that obviously continues to this day because Clemson's so prominent and he is so prominent, and you're obviously talking to him on a fairly regular basis at present?
Yeah, and I don't talk to Brent as often probably as some people think, but we do talk, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for him. More than that, I really like him. But I always think that respect is the more important piece of those kinds of things. So, look, I got to know Brent when he was, co-defensive coordinator with Mike Stoops on Bob Stoops' early staff at Oklahoma. My first year covering Oklahoma football was 2000, which was their second year in Norman, my first year in Norman, and it's the year they won the national title. Went 13-0. And so that's how I got to know Brent, was just through the years talking with him in various, settings, and just really coming to appreciate the way he approached the job and the way he approached people. Because you and I both know there can be sort of a built-in antagonism between reporters and coaches and players, and it doesn't always have to be that way, but sometimes it just is. And sometimes we work at cross purposes with those guys, and because we're our job we're not on the team even, and sometimes they wonder why that's the case. Why are we not on the team? Mm-hmm. And so you're just, I always just sort of assume that there's going to be potentially some kind of a distance between me and the guy I'm covering, and that's fine, and that's probably the way it should be most of the time. With Brent, I can count on a couple of fingers the times he was upset with me. And when he was upset, it was, he gets over it pretty quick. But he just generally approached people with kind of a kindness. I guess it's like this, when you meet coaches and you go, that's a pretty good guy. And then you realize I'm saying that's a pretty good guy on this scale of coach, not necessarily on this regular guy scale. Yeah. You can be a really good guy on a coach scale and be like a 4 on a regular guy scale. I don't see Brent that way. I see Brent as kind of a good guy that you want to hang out with and grab a coffee with or whatever. He's one of those guys that rates pretty high, I think, just in the way he interacts with people. Never mind a coach scale, put him on a regular guy scale. So that's just the way I, kind of came to know him. And it's different when you meet a guy when he's young, because, he's in his 20s at the time, late 20s at the time, as an up-and-coming defensive mind. And you're a young beat writer at the time. And so you meet these guys a little bit different than when you sort of come in and meet them later on in a career, or they meet you later on in a career. And so we just always sort of had a pretty easy relationship. And that's how I met him, and really came to appreciate him through the years. Like I said, the way he sort of treats people and is interested in people beyond sort of the bounds of the job is something that I really appreciate.
His decision to go out on his own in January of 2012 is fascinating on so many levels. Okay, were you there at that time?
No, I was still in Eugene, and hadn't even taken the USA Today job yet. So my focus at that point was on University of Oregon, Oregon State, and Pac-12 and that kind of thing. But I was aware of it. It is fascinating, and there's some backstory there, including the fact that, at the time, Brent was taking some of the heat that we have later in these more recent years sort of seen Mike Stoops end up taking at Oklahoma for their defenses not being quite as good, or at least not seen as quite as good as they had been in the 2000s. I mean, in the 2000s, Oklahoma's defenses for a long period of time were fantastic. And Brent and Mike Stoops worked together for a while, and then Mike Stoops went off to become the Arizona head coach, and Brent was, elevated to sort of being the guy, and those were great defenses. And so then, coinciding with a slight dip in the entire program, really, the defense began, and by the way, a slight dip in the entire Oklahoma football program, but also a rise in the danger of the Big 12 offenses around them. Suddenly the defensive coordinator was taking a lot of heat. And when Mike Stoops returned to Norman, there were a whole lot of people who looked at him as sort of, all right, now things are going to be good again, because boy, that Brent Venables has not been getting it done. I mean, that's sort of the nature of fans, right? So that's always instructive for me if I'm considering the Mike Stoops situation at Oklahoma, which obviously ended badly this last year when he was let go after they gave up 48 points to Texas in a loss in October. He was supposed to be the savior coming back in, and it was Brent Venables who was taking some heat, and he never took it to the extent that Mike took it here down these last few years. But Brent's a terrific football coach. We all know that. He's great with X's and O's. He's a great recruiter. He's really good. And this shouldn't surprise us, given what we were just talking about how he deals with people who aren't on the team. He's really good at developing relationships with the players who play for him. And I think it was a great move for him to move off and do his own thing, because on the one hand, you get a reset, and people look at you as like, you're coming from the University of Oklahoma. We need big-time defensive coordinator. That's who you are. And the Clemson fans are not really aware that over in Oklahoma, he's been taking a lot of heat for things that, fans just sort of get on defensive coordinators about. And he gets to reset. He gets to not be the guy who's always been the protege of Bob Stoops, and to a lesser degree, Mike Stoops. He gets to go out on his own, and he gets to build his own defense, and we've seen what happened.
Another fascinating element to him deciding to leave was that you just mentioned a lot of typical sort of a clinical way that coaches view sort of when it's time to get out, or when it makes sense. But man, that was such a different situation, and you can hear it now when Brent talks about his time under Bob Stoops. That was like a family. I mean, they had been together for so long, and so it was an emotionally wrenching decision.
It was a hard thing for him to do. To hear him, he's described that to you, to me, to others. It was a hard thing for him to do, to say, Bob, I'm going to leave. Mike, I'm going to leave. I mean, you think about this. It was, despite what I just said about fans and how they were sort of, down on him, that was a really comfortable situation in Norman. A very stable, very comfortable situation in Norman. And had he stayed, maybe it would have remained that way, right? I mean, there's nothing that says things were going to spiral downhill. I'm not suggesting that. But I'm saying within the walls of the Oklahoma football program, that's probably about as comfortable a situation as you could be. He'd been there for, 13, 14 years, whatever it was at that point. And he was maybe 15, I guess. That was essentially his entire professional career had been spent there. Obviously, he started at K-State with those guys, played at K-State, and then began coaching there, and then moved to Oklahoma with the very first coaching staff when Bob Stoops got the job. That was a wrenching decision to leave. And as it turns out, it was exactly the right decision and exactly the right place, and for him professionally, and obviously also for Clemson.
He didn't come out and say this directly to me. I'm concluding this mostly, but I think that he knew Willie Martinez was on the way out, and that kind of shook him up some. Also, maybe Stoops had lost some of his fastball, even though his reduced fastball was still better than most. They were a little bit diminished from what they had been.
Clearly, in the recruiting department.
Yes.
But yes.
He wanted stability. He was sort of plotting his next move, not necessarily with the next year in mind, but the next 10 years in mind. By the way, do you know the story of how Dabo came across the fact that Venables was interested?
Didn't Terry Don pass him the name? Yeah,
yes.
I don't know. I've heard it, but I've forgotten it.
Yeah, so Terry Don in 2008, when Dabo was auditioning for the job, he was still conducting a coaching search, and so he flew out to Oklahoma City and interviewed Venables.
That's right.
And was thoroughly impressed with him. In fact, Terry Don told me a few months ago that had Dabo not worked out with his audition, that Venables would have been the guy that he hired. So fast forward to January of 2012, Dabo was 95% sure he had found his guy. I don't know who that guy was, and Dabo still won't tell me to this day, which tells me this guy is still at the position he was in then, and it would be uncomfortable for that to be publicized, but maybe one day we'll find out. But Brent called Terry Don because he had no relationship with Dabo, but he had watched Clemson from afar and loved what he had been seeing from Dabo, going on his outburst after the Auburn game, and just the sort of different way he was leading a program. And so Terry Don wrote Brent's number on a piece of paper and handed it to Dabo and said, "Hey, this is your decision. You can do what you want to do, but I'm just letting you know that this guy's interested." And so Dabo called him up later that night. They talked for 3 hours. The next day, Brent and his wife Julie are in Clemson looking around, and then it was everybody knows the story from there. So pretty amazing. And also, I hate to dominate this part of the interview with you, but going back to Oklahoma, Brent said he and Julie cried the whole 4 hours in the air on the way back because they knew they were going to leave. They were going to have to leave because they were just so smitten with Clemson. But when it came time for Brent to tell Bob Stoops, Brent reconsidered. I think they sweetened the pot for him and matched the salary that Clemson was offering. And Brent actually called Dabo and told him I think he left him a voicemail that he was staying at Oklahoma. And then Brent goes home and he says Julie was cooking spaghetti or something. And he says, "Honey, we're staying here." And she was the one who said, "I'll be danged if we are." She said, "You remember how happy we were when we went to Clemson, and how excited we were." And she turned him back toward Clemson. Brent calls Dabo back, says he's coming, and then that part, the rest is history from that juncture as well. So pretty amazing story about how that developed.
Well, it really is. And you know what? I don't know that that's probably, if we could get, and listen, one of the reasons that that story is because Brent Venables is so much more open sometimes than some other guys, but it's probably not that unusual a story. Wives are a big part of this, and a vibe and a feel are a big part of this, and all sorts of calculations go into it. And sometimes it's a very emotional thing. Very often it is. We look at the assistant coaches like it's some itinerant profession, because it is, but he's not been itinerant. And so maybe he's a little bit different. I can only imagine how hard it was to sort of leave the nest in some ways, which is kind of what Brent Venables did when he went to Clemson. Even though he'd been running the show defensively for several years, basically ever since Mike Stoops had taken a head coaching job at Arizona, you're still sort of in a very comfortable situation. And when he finally left, there had to be a lot of really good reasons for it. And it had to be an anxious time for him too, even though they probably felt like they were making the right decision.
Yet another element to this, George, was, I guess, 6 months, within the previous 6 months, within a 24-hour period, Brent had lost his older brother to alcoholism, and also Austin Box, one of his prized linebackers at Oklahoma, to a drug overdose. And we were talking earlier about how the experience with Christopher shook your foundations, and I believe that it's reasonable to think that Brent going through what he went through sort of shook his foundations enough for him to start thinking about, wait a minute, maybe I need to leave the nest. Maybe there's something else out there, not just professionally, but spiritually. I know that he has said that his the spiritual side of him and his family has grown so much since he's been here. And so yet another sort of dynamic to that just makes it a pretty remarkable story of how he got here.
Well, I think what's interesting, and I don't know how those two events and other events might or might not have affected his thinking or his perspective on life. I'm sure they did, alter his perspective. But I think one of the things I would take from that is this. We typically, and by we, I mean you, I mean me, I mean the folk listening to this podcast, we typically know so little about how these decisions happen, and we sort of think of them in these almost binary ways. Coach X decides to go to University Y because of a salary or because of an opportunity to move up. And, maybe that is all it is some of the time. But there's usually so much more that goes into it. And maybe more than even that guy could explain if he wanted to explain, because it's sort of, it's not always just sort of pure logic that goes into these decisions. I mean, it made a lot of sense logically, especially looking back, right, in hindsight, but even at the time for Brent Venables to make the move. But there's so much more that goes into those kinds of things. And it's instructive to hear these kinds of things and think, you know what, I might not ever know why the next guy decides to make a move, whether it's coming to the school or leaving the school or whatever. But there's usually a whole lot more that goes into it than just sort of what we sort of read about, what we report, So I don't know if that makes any sense at all, but I think it's at least worth knowing.
George, we are both, I guess, sports writers in title, but there is a galaxy of difference between what you do and what I do, mainly, obviously, covering one team versus covering the entire world of college football. And with you having been a beat guy, having covered Oklahoma, just one team, what has that adjustment been like? What's the biggest, difference between the two? I guess it's self-evident, and that you just have to be on top of a lot more teams.
Well, I mean, so there's a 30,000-foot view that you sort of have to take, as though you're sort of flying over the country from 30,000 feet. Obviously, that's the analogy. Whereas when I covered Oklahoma, and to a lesser extent when I wasn't the beat writer, but when I was a columnist in Eugene, you are sort of hyper focused on the one team and a lot of things that are really important to the local sort of fan base. And those are the kinds of things you focus on. So, when I used to cover Oklahoma, it was very important when the backup left tackle left, right? Well, now, if the backup left tackle leaves Clemson or Oklahoma, or you name the playoff team, that doesn't matter as much to me. It matters tremendously to the local fan bases. And so the hard part sometimes is figuring out, all right, at what level does this rise to, okay, this is really important to a national audience. And I also find myself sort of covering things nowadays, and this is not necessarily because I'm on a national level, but because of the way things have changed, or maybe it's a combination, is we now cover things through the prism of the playoff. And so if it doesn't really impact the playoff somehow, we don't cover it as often or as much as, or there's a higher bar to clear before we would cover it now. And I don't know if that's necessarily a good thing, but I think it's reality. It is what it is. And I think if you look around, you can see that, you know, on the one hand, so Clemson fans want to know everything that's going on with Clemson football. All right. But on the other hand, they also want to know how it sort of impacts their chances of making the run at another national title. And when they look around college football, they're really paying attention to those other contenders. And I actually think that's pretty much true of every fan base now. You pay a ton of attention to your own fan base, and then you pay attention to the playoff, whatever that means. Most fan bases aren't really involved in the playoff like Clemson's are. So I don't know if I've answered your question at all, but there's a 30,000-foot view that you have versus a digging deep into the roots of a program, which is what you're trying to do when you're on the local beat. And then there's also the truth this, Larry, you know a ton more about Clemson than I'm ever going to know. And so that doesn't mean I'm not going to try to break some news sometimes if I get it. But it means it's a whole lot harder for me to get it than it is for you to get it. And it's a whole lot harder for me to get news on Alabama than it is for the Birmingham guy or the Tuscaloosa guy. And so that's not always our focus. On the other hand, you know this too, what also happens is if I come to town, those guys are more willing to talk to me and sit down one-on-one sometimes than they are to talk to the local guys. And that's not necessarily fair, but I've also found out it's because from their perspective, I'm not like in their business all the time, you know? And so kind of funny when so it's not like Bob Stoops and I always got along when I was the beat writer covering Oklahoma for the Oklahoman, which is the Oklahoma City paper. When I came back and actually moved back to town, and he was obviously still the head coach until, 2 years ago, we got along a whole lot better. And that's because I'd write, the only times I have written, a bunch of stories about Oklahoma these last couple of years, but that goes back to because they've been playoff relevant. If they're winning 8 games, I'm not writing much about Oklahoma, even though I live in town. And when I did write about him, it was a whole lot more of the 30,000-foot view that is built for a national audience. And so I wasn't in his business asking why the left tackle didn't play last week or that kind of thing, which is the job of the guys who are covering that team on a daily basis. And, so there wasn't the same kind of a friction going on. And so Bob and I got along great while he was coach. Now we really get along great because he plays a lot of golf and doesn't have a care in the world. But, so I don't think I've really answered your question, but it's just a different kind of relationship. And so when I was a beat writer, going back to the access, it always sort of chafed a little bit when somebody would come in. My friend Dennis Dodd from CBS Sports would come in and get that access that I couldn't get or I didn't regularly get. And so I understand that now as a national guy, and I get it when people maybe are a little resentful. I also realize this, if those coaches for whatever reason are going to provide that access, and typically it's because they think it's a giant recruiting tool. If they're going to provide that access, I'm going to take full advantage of it.
I was talking to Ralph Russo on the podcast in December before the semifinal, and he was basically, he has a similar job to yours, and he was saying that just to make sure he doesn't miss anything, he basically lives on Twitter all day.
No question. Yeah, no question. Live on Twitter all day. 15 years ago, what it would have been, and I wasn't a national writer at the time, is you would have had like 5 places or 8 places that you surfed every day through the web. And now sort of Twitter brings it to you, depending on who you follow. And I basically follow, a bunch of people who cover the sport that that I cover, and including you and including a ton of other guys who cover their teams on a local basis, and it's like, oh, I better check this out. I better read this. Oh, that's interesting tidbit of news. And exactly, you live on Twitter more than you'd like to, quite frankly, but it's part of the job. Right now, as we sit here, I'm using a program called TweetDeck, and it is sitting on my laptop. And what TweetDeck does is, instead of refreshing Twitter constantly, with your thumb on your phone or having to hit the refresh button on twitter.com on your laptop, it rotates. It just basically refreshes automatically. And so it's almost like a continuous sort of scroll of the people I follow. And sometimes can be a little overwhelming. It can be like drinking from a fire hose, but it is what it is. And I completely agree with Ralph. Frankly, Ralph is so good at what he does. I'm glad to hear he's doing the same thing I'm doing.
Big supporter of Clemson athletics and now a loyal supporter of the Clemson Dubcast is Harris Flooring America. Based in Anderson, South Carolina, Harris Flooring has been instrumental in a lot of the facilities transformation you've seen on Clemson's campus lately. From the Allen Reeves Center to the McFadden Building to Memorial Stadium to the Neary Center, Harris Flooring has been at the ground floor, pun intended, of all this. Family owned and operated since 1947. The owner, Scott Junkins, big Clemson guy. He employs Clemson folks. And keep in mind, it's not just commercial. Harris Flooring is just as good inside the home and the residential realm as they are with the larger scale commercial stuff. Floor to ceiling design capabilities. Give them a call, 864-642-6183 or online at flooringamerica-anderson.com. So I might spend 15 minutes a day on Twitter. I don't know. I spend a lot
envy you.
Yeah, and the main reason is it shortens my attention span. You just get locked into this. Do you, given that you have to stay on it, have you self-imposed a sort of discipline where, okay, I'm only going to do it, I'm going to use this time to recharge, just from a mental organizational standpoint? How do you stay fresh when it feels like the longer you're on Twitter, the more impossible it is to feel mentally fresh? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does make sense. And if I figure out that balance, I'll let you know, but I haven't yet. It's hard. And it does seem to shorten my attention span. My assumption is probably, listen, I don't know if that's just Twitter. I think that's us with sort of the mobile smartphone, buried your head into the social media thing that we're all doing nowadays, it seems like. But I do think we got to sort of impose limits on that just as people. The jobs that we have require us to sort of be on some of these social media platforms to sort of, like Ralph was telling you, in my case, in his case, to sort of keep up with things that are going on or make sure you're not missing things. And it's not really FOMO, fear of missing out, in terms of sort of the larger sense of that. It's more like you can't miss out because something may pop on your job. I don't have a good way to tell you. My problem is this: I can be done with my work for the day, and I feel like I need to still be constantly checking Twitter at 7:30, at night, or 8:30 at night. And I don't know that that's actually the case, but you get that jittery feeling that way. And that's before we ever talk about the short attention span. It has definitely altered the way that I write, not so much the style that I write, but in it being able to complete a task. Sometimes I just have to close that program, TweetDeck, that I just mentioned, and just write and just say, if something weird happens, I'm going to get a call from my editor or a text from my editor. And so I just need to spend time here, writing this story or whatever. And sometimes that's what I have to do, but it's hard to do that. It's hard not to want to click back over or open that program back up and take a look at what I think I might be missing. Most of the time, the answer is nothing.
Is there a time of day, like, say, dinner time or post 9 p.m., where you're like, okay, I'm turning it off?
Well, let me just put it this way, because I'm dealing with teenagers who have smartphones. I definitely try to make sure that we don't check our smartphones at dinner, that that I don't carry my smartphone with me all over the place. I work out, when I'm not traveling, I work out of the house, right? Which already sort of imposes a weird, like, how do you balance work and family sometimes? How do you turn the work off and get back to family? But I don't do a great job of this, but I try to leave the phone at the desk in my home office when I go visit with Christopher and hang out with the family. And again, I really don't do a very good job of that, but that's what I want to do. The other time for me when I can turn it off is you mentioned me running with Brent Venables. I run, and that's been a stress reliever for a long time. And so that is a good, nice, sustained period of time, not daily, but 4 or 5 times a week when I run, that I'm not, even thinking about those kinds of things. And I find it's really refreshing mentally too.
What do you remember most from that run with Venables, I guess, 3+ years ago?
Well, it was a beautiful morning. We ran up, it's not really a boardwalk, but kind of a sidewalk, I guess, up on the Atlantic Ocean there on Miami Beach. And so the first thing is this: Brent Venables is just an animal, right? I mean, all right, now, he's not necessarily the fastest runner you're ever going to meet, but he runs every day, basically. At the time, he had some crazy streak going, and I don't know if he still has that going, or if as you get older, you sometimes all of a sudden a muscle goes and you have to wait a couple of weeks. But he had some crazy streak going, and I actually decided after that, all right, I'm going to do this. And it wasn't too long after that I ended up with a long streak of my own that had to stop because I actually did get injured, right? Just what happens. But we just we found a pace that we could both live with and we could talk at, which is not always the case when you're running with somebody. You have a different pace, and one of the guys may be really struggling to keep up and can't really talk. And we just talked, and it was a lot of fun. And I asked him a few questions, and the weird thing was you can't really take a notebook and write things down while you're running, right? So I actually had to stop afterwards, and I just said, hey, can we go back over this, that, or the other? But it was really a lot of conversation, a lot of stuff that never made it into that column. And I thought it was fun for me. I don't know if it was fun for him or not, but I think he enjoyed the interlude. He's kind of a solitary runner. I am too. So it was a little different for both of us. But I think it's the kind of thing where you can do something normal with somebody is a good way to just sort of see the other guy as a person. And again, I think Brent's always been really good about doing that with people anyway, but it was just kind of fun for both of us it was almost like seeing somebody in a different environment than you normally see them, if that makes sense.
Well, that is a heck of an accomplishment, getting him during a season, I guess a day or two before a college football playoff semifinal, to focus on something other than football, or to divert his attention, because you probably don't know this, but Ross Taylor, the communications director for football, and Tim Barre before him, getting Venables to show up to a regularly scheduled press conference during the season, during the week, on a Monday is it's very difficult.
But here's the thing. Probably he wouldn't enjoy this, but if you could get the entire Clemson press corps to show up at 5:30 in the morning or whatever crazy time. First of all, I'm a sports writer. I don't run at 5 a.m. All right. He's a football coach. He does. So that was an adjustment for me that morning, as I had to get up from Fort Lauderdale and drive down to Miami Beach and meet him. And I'm sitting here thinking to myself, why am I up this early? And he's sitting here thinking to himself, I'm always up this early. But if you get the entire Clemson press corps to get in shape and show up for runs with him, you might be able to get him. Now, I'm not sure he would enjoy that, but that might be the key, because here's the thing. He's already going to be doing that. It's part of his day.
Yeah.
It's not something that feels like an extra thing. It is non-football, but it's like part of what he does. It's part of his daily regimen. So that might have been what it was. It's not like I said, can I have 30 minutes that's going to take you away from something that you feel like you need to be doing, preparing.
Well, the first component of your equation, getting the Clemson press corps in shape enough to run with him, is probably a bigger miracle than actually getting to run with him.
I was sort of kind of envisioning how that would go. And I thought, A, Clemson's going to need to have people sign waivers, and B, ambulances will need to stand by. Not for you, but for some of your cohort.
There's a group, a workout group in Clemson, an F3 group that gathers every Monday, Wednesday, and Saturday morning early, 5:30 on Mondays and Wednesdays. And I actually invited him one time, and he says, "What time?" I said, 5:30. He said, "Man, that's too early." So I think he's maybe more of the 6 o'clock, between 6 and 7 variety.
Yeah, I was trying to think about when it was, and I think you're right. It was about 6 that I ended up catching up with him. But listen, that was one of the more fun things I've ever done. I've done that twice in my career. I ran one time when I was a columnist in Eugene. I ran one time with Chip Kelly. He would run midday when he, kind of lunchtime run, and we ran, and that was a ton of fun too. And you get to know somebody a little bit differently when you do that. So if I could pull that off, maybe I should try to make that a regular feature. But I don't know if you can really do that. But both times I thought it was really illuminating for me, and hopefully it was for the reader too.
Wow, Chip Kelly, notoriously hard to get to know. So you were able to...
Wasn't as hard at that point. This was early in his tenure, probably, I don't know if it was year 1 or year 2 of his tenure as Oregon's coach, but it was before he'd really gotten as tight as he's gotten with the media, or as closed as he's gotten with the media.
You traveled to Tuscaloosa recently, visited with Nick Saban?
I did.
Bill King, the noted radio personality, I had him on. I talked to him yesterday. He said from people he knows around Nick Saban that Nick is violently upset over what happened in San Jose. What was your takeaway from your visit with him in that respect?
Yeah, well, I don't know if he's violently upset, but let's start with this. I mean, Alabama had lost some games, not very many during his tenure, but they'd never been blown out like that. And we can talk about how that was sort of a snowball game, and how if you played it 5 times, they might have won a couple, and they might have lost a couple, but there would not have been another blowout. And I think that's all fair. I think Clemson was the better team. I think Alabama was flawed, and that we didn't see it all year long, especially defensively. They were flawed by their standards. We didn't see it. We were bedazzled by how good their offense had been all year long, so how much different it was than anything we'd seen. And I think Clemson was the better team. But they haven't been beaten by 4 touchdowns in his entire tenure. And to have that happen in a national title game, I'm sure that was a bit of a shock even to a guy who probably never admits to ever being surprised by anything. And then looking back, is people look at this like it's excuse making, but I think there is some truth to the fact that they probably did get a little full of themselves at a certain point. Again, I think Clemson was the better team. I think that's clear. I also do think that Alabama probably heard some of the stuff that was being said and written about how this might be the best of the Nick Saban teams, and boy, how good is this team really? And probably took it to heart a little bit. And that happens with football teams. And so I think when you hear him saying things like that right now, the natural thing for Clemson fans is to go, yeah, he's making excuses. He's not giving us credit. That's not what he's doing. He's looking at some of the factors from his team. And all that said, I think he thinks there were some coaches that weren't fully invested and that they didn't do as good a job as some of his staffs, and some players that maybe weren't fully invested all the way down through the end of the season. And I'm sure he also looks back and says, I made a few mistakes here along the way, including maybe a couple of those staff hires or promotions. And he has clearly, since that loss, worked to try to rectify those situations. And by the way, given the way they lost, or even just the fact that they lost, sometimes that rectifies the situation, right? It creates a hunger that you don't have when you win. So Dabo's issue this year is, how do I keep these guys hungry? Obviously, he's also got to rebuild the defensive line. But mentally, it's like, how do you stay hungry after you've climbed to the top of the mountain and you finally got there? That's something that Nick Saban has to deal with quite often. It's a lot easier, frankly, this offseason than it probably is some off seasons.
Well, George, were you at the Sugar Bowl in 2017 between Bama and Clemson?
Sugar Bowl 17. I was not. I was at the Rose Bowl, Oklahoma, Georgia.
Well, every single person in that building that night, press, fans, otherwise, can tell you that from the opening kickoff, the palpable sense that Alabama was pissed off was inescapable. And that came from spending a year hearing about how Clemson was the better team that beat you at the last second the year before, that Clemson was this is a passing of the torch,
Coulda, woulda, shoulda beat you the year before, people would tell them. Yeah, I mean, the year before that. And so, yeah, no, I don't disagree with that. And listen, when you get a team as talented and as deep as Alabama and then you add motivation, that's a pretty potent combination. I would also tell you, I just think Clemson didn't quite have the offense that it needed to stick with them that year, because that wasn't a great Alabama offense. It was a really good Alabama defense. But, hey, we may be heading into the same kind of situation this year. Alabama's going to be really talented again and really motivated, which they may or may not have been as the season went along last year. Meanwhile, Clemson's going to be really talented, but it's got to rebuild some on the defense. And how motivated will the Tigers be? And you can talk about, hey, we're going to be motivated. We're not going to be complacent. But there's a little bit of this that's just sort of the human condition, and it's hard to gin up. It just is what it is, and you're more motivated when you're hungrier or angrier.
No doubt. That chip on the shoulder. George, this is something we talked about, I think, in the wee hours back at the media hotel after the national championship game. And something I'm not sure is made enough of, not that it's a big deal, but you look back at those two Alabama games against Georgia in the national championship and then in the SEC championship this past year. No, Alabama has not lost as badly as they did to Clemson in San Jose, but there were moments in both of those games against Georgia where they were very close to getting their doors blown off. And Georgia just wasn't good enough to do it. And so that's kind of fascinating to me, just thinking back, because, if Georgia has a couple of better calls, if they don't call a fake punt, then we're talking about something else entirely probably, right? The last 2 years.
Well, yeah, absolutely. If they don't come back to beat Georgia in the national title game, if that happens, maybe they're more motivated this year or in 2018. That's part of this deal. If they don't come back if Jalen Hurts doesn't come back, doesn't bring them back, and you're right, Kirby Smart contributed that with an inexplicable fake punt when you're still up a touchdown if you just punt them deep. I don't know if Jalen Hurts brings them back from 85 yards away rather than from midfield. Maybe he does, but to me, once the fake punt didn't work, the momentum was such that Jalen Hurts had both on offense and just sort of the momentum from that failed fake punt that it changed things. Who knows what happens if Alabama loses to Georgia in either or both of those games? Who knows? But the thing about it is Nick Saban's tenure has had some pivot point games like that, and quite often he's found a way to win them. I mean, I'm thinking back to the first game with Clemson. I thought Clemson was a better team in that game, and I thought Alabama was a better team in the game that Clemson won with the Deshaun Watson pass to Hunter Renfrow with 1 second left. But in that first game, I think Nick Saban understood, we're not stopping this offense. I better steal a possession here. And he came up with what was a terrifically risky. They act like it wasn't a risky thing. It was a crazy risk to go for that onside kick. And it was the perfect time to do it. It caught people by surprise, and it altered the game. He did that because he understood what might be about to happen, which was we're not going to stop Clemson. And I think he was right about that. And, by stealing possession, he effectively won the game. There have been some pivot point games like that, and some of that is because he's a great coach.
Yeah, and then the Hunter Renfrow tackle of Ryan Anderson early in the third quarter in Tampa was probably bigger than his touchdown catch with 1 second left. Because
that's a good point.
That prevented the game from turning into possibly a typical Alabama route. George, two final quick questions. Number one, Do you think Brent Venables will close his career having been a head coach?
Oh, at this point, it seems like he's so settled in now, and now he's making so much money. Again, this is not a binary thing, but if you wanted to make a move because being a head coach provides you a ton of money, and obviously it really does, ask Dabo. But hey, when you're making $2 million a year as a defense coordinator, and there's so much less pressure, which is kind of what the top level defense coordinators can do now, that's not a bad life. I mean, there's pressure on as being a defense coordinator, but it's nothing compared to running an entire program. And you're at a place that you've helped build into what may be a dynasty. So I wouldn't be surprised if he remains an assistant coach his entire career. But it wouldn't. Let me put it this way: it would take a pretty special job opportunity for Brent Venables to leave at this point. He's not going for a mid-level Power 5 job. It would have to be a great job. And at one point, I think a mid-level Power 5 job would have been the kind of job he would have taken. But I don't think he's there anymore.
In the next 5 years, what's the over-under on how many national titles Clemson picks up?
Oh, 2. Let's just say 2. I think that's, and I don't necessarily mean 2019 and 2020 because Trevor Lawrence is the quarterback, presumably, for both those seasons. But that'd be a good place to start. Winning national titles is really, really hard. And obviously Clemson and Alabama, in whichever order you want to put them, have elevated themselves beyond everybody else at this point. And I don't know how close some of these other programs are. But even so, they're hard to win. They're really hard to win. In what Nick Saban has done in winning 5 at Alabama makes people think, oh, it's doable. Well, it's in what Dabo Swinney has done in winning 2 here in the last few years makes people think, oh, you're just going to keep doing it. It's really hard to do. So if I say 2, it's that I wouldn't be stunned by that. I think when you start getting to 3 or 4, it's like, yeah, that's just not going to happen. I'd be delighted to be wrong. I just think it's a lot harder than we all know because goofy things happen. What happens if what happens a year from now if, Syracuse pops, because that seems to be the matchup that gives the Tigers a problem. What if Syracuse pops them and it ends up being the kind of thing that knocks you out of the playoffs? Or what happens if there's just so many things that can happen, right? What if Trevor, and we certainly don't wish this, tweaks an ankle at the wrong time? It's hard. I'll go with 2, and I don't feel confident about that at all either way, but because they're hard to win.
If this continues, which everybody is assuming, Alabama and Clemson with so much separation playing each other at the end of the year every year, is that problematic in your mind? Is that problematic for college football?
Well, the answer is go beat them, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't think it's necessarily good for college football. Better would be parity, and by the way, not just parity like 2 different teams, but parity from different regions. So, yeah, it's probably not great for college football, but I don't know that it's terrible either. I mean, if you look around other sports, we've seen times when 1 or 2 teams dominated and the sport seemed to survive. I think what's going to be important for college football, more than whether or not Clemson or Alabama gets knocked off the top, is going to be the Big Ten getting involved. It's going to be the Big 12 winning a national title at some point, whether that's Oklahoma or Texas. It's going to be the Pac-12 getting back on its feet. When is that going to happen? I don't know. These things are a little bit cyclical. It seems like the South is going to be great forever in football, and I don't disagree with that, in terms of the recruiting edge and things like that. But these things are cyclical. And at a certain point, an Ohio State will rise, or a Texas or an Oklahoma will win one. USC, I don't think, will be down forever. But for right now, it is what it is. And I'm not one of those guys who's developed Clemson or Alabama fatigue at this point.
George Schroeder, thank you so much for your time and insight, and particularly sharing the wonderful story about your son, Christopher.
Well, Hey, thank you for the opportunity, Larry, man. I really appreciate it. And I just, I never want to just sort of assume people want to hear about Christopher, but I'm always glad to talk about him if somebody wants to.
Thank you so much. I know that our listeners are going to really get a lot out of this.
Well, I hope so. And listen, man, I look forward to seeing you down the road here. Hopefully we can break bread sometime soon.
Looking forward to it, George. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry.
All right. Wow, that was so good. Thank you so much to George for taking so much of his time to open up about the wonderful story of his son Christopher, about his faith, about how he handled things professionally during that very, very, very difficult time. And then on a much more secondary level, thanks to George for talking about his experiences in relationship with Brent Venables and thoughts on him and the Clemson program in general. So thanks to George, and thanks also to our sponsors for helping make this happen. Title sponsor, Parham Smith Arch & Hull Law Firm in downtown Greenville. Also in Greenville, Tandem Payment. Over yonder in Anderson is Harris Flooring America, and then smack dab in Clemson is the Abernathy Boutique Hotel. And a warm welcome to our newest sponsor, Patrick Enzer of Uptown Realty, LLC in the Sumter and Eastern Midlands PD area. Grateful for all of our sponsors for their loyal support, but most grateful to all of you listeners who are making this a part of your routine. Really appreciate it. And stay tuned for next week's. I guess we're going to do one next week. Well, who knows? We'll see. Everybody have a great weekend. Cheers.